Open Government Partnership Asia and the Pacific Regional Meeting. So I really hope that you've had that chance to just dig in. It's a full week of inspiring and productive sessions. We're going to be starting the more meaningful discussions, I guess what you call the deep dive. I'd like to call it that for the second day of our event. We're looking forward to further deepening the dialogue and reinforcing that shared commitment to such intangibles that are so important to a multisectoral group as this, on transparency, accountability, and citizen participation. So just a bit of a recap here. Yesterday, we set the stage for some truly impactful conversations. So as we move forward today, let's just take those key learnings with us and turn them into even bigger opportunities. And today, we begin with 3 sessions happening concurrently. So it's going to be a really busy schedule here in this floor of the hotel. But in this room, we are honored to host a high-level session that will explore the key economic and democratic trends shaping the region, the risks and opportunities they present, and how open government solutions can play a key role in ensuring sustainable growth, security, and prosperity. It is my privilege to introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. Joseph Foti, the Principal Advisor, Emerging Issues, Open Government Partnership. Mr. Foti, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We're going to introduce the exciting speakers that we have today. So again, my name is Joe, and first up, we have Dr. Moya Khalid. Dr. Khalid is the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of Australia in the Philippines. Dr. Khalid is a senior career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT, and was most recently the Assistant Secretary of the Southeast Asia Maritime Branch. She's held a number of senior roles at DFAT and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, including head of the Southeast Asia Vaccines Access Task Force and the Assistant Secretary of the Middle East Branch. Next, we have Duya Batar. Duya is the founder and chairperson of the Nest Center for Journalism, Innovation, and Development. Before that, she was at Bloomberg Mongolia, where she played many roles as a reporter, anchor, and senior producer. At the age of 25, she became the editor-in-chief of Mongolia's 3rd largest daily newspaper, the Official Gazette, the youngest person to ever hold that position. Most recently, she is the co-founder of the Nest Center and a McCain Global Leader in 2022. Now we have Secretary Robert Borja. A career diplomat with nearly 2 decades in government service, Secretary Borja is the vice chairperson and executive director of the Climate Change Commission, the Philippines' lead policymaking body on climate change. He is the national focal point to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, heading and handling various negotiation work streams that include adaptation, mitigation, and climate finance. Next, we have Eri Rihanna. Eri comes from the Collective Action Coalition Against Corruption, the Kaki Alliance in Indonesia, which represents a number of private sector companies. He is a prominent figure within Indonesia's anti-corruption movement and was one of the first commissioners on the Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, from 2003 to 2007. He's a professional entrusted to hold the position of commissioner in several companies and has 40 years of experience in good governance and anti-corruption, particularly in business and NGO fields. And our final participant is Sankita Gunaratne. Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption and the Deputy Director at Verite Research, and she brings extensive expertise in anti-corruption advocacy and governance in Sri Lanka. Welcome to the participants. You may all be seated now. So today's session is maybe a bit different. It's a bunch of new ideas, and we're going to discuss governance and some other concepts: the new economy, the energy transition, democratic security, and what does it all mean to learn across countries and perhaps cooperate across countries. So the theme of this panel has a little bit of a paradox at its center, because it's about this idea of democratic resilience, the idea that individual countries are actually stronger when they work together, across boundaries, but also within the countries, between the sectors, between parts of society. And so I hope you can see that with the makeup and diversity of the region that the panelists represent, as well as the sectors that they represent. But also, I think that each of them may speak to their own national experiences and how that, but I think nonetheless, despite the unique national experiences, those are things that can be learned across, there's things that can be learned across the different countries. So we're going to get right into it. To Secretary Borge, let's discuss that theme of collaboration and learning across social and national boundaries. How's your government addressing this challenge? Can you share an example of the Philippines applying this approach to the climate issue, or one of the climate issues?
Thank you. I think there's a basic and fundamental issue that we have to understand also. It's not just these paradoxes that you've identified. For us, I think the Philippine experience, we can identify three things. The paradoxes are independence and interdependence. It's also about cooperation versus competition. It's also about clarity and confusion when it comes to the data and information that's present out there. These three are important to understand because these are realities that we have to face. For example, the Philippines is a developing country wishing to become a upper middle income economy. Of course, we're very fiercely independent, and we know that sovereignty is an important governance principle and something that we should protect. At the same time, we do have to be interdependent and work with a lot of stakeholders to advance shared goals and aspirations. It's also important for us to learn that there's a lot of confusion or clarity depending on the data governance framework that's there, not just in the Philippine setting, but also for the regional setting. So if we want to move towards upper middle income economy, we need open data governance so that there's more clarity in the way we do things. At the same time, I would say that these create tensions in governance, but it's totally understandable. As a democracy, this is part of the work that we should do. We should engage all of the stakeholders. And I would like to put up an example of what we do. For example, we have the National Adaptation Plan and the National Determined Contribution Implementation Plan. For the longest time, these two were frameworks that were simply ideas. But under President Marcos, climate change has become a priority. And it has always been an issue with the Philippines how to come up with policy frameworks. But for these particular policy frameworks, the National Adaptation Plan and the National Determined Contribution Implementation Plan, we did have a governance and engagement framework, including the participation not only of the academe, not only of the non-governmental organizations, not only of the government organizations, but including businesses and practitioners. And this helped formulate these two important policy tools. And we were able to do this for the NAP in under 10 months and for the NDCIP in 5 months. So what does this say? If the governance framework is there, and if the people who are supposed to be engaged are actively working, then we're able to move towards high quality discussion and an output and an outcome that we want. So there are a lot of challenges, a lot of tensions for any developing country, but there needs to be that framework and the people need to be involved. And I say this because climate change is an existential issue. Loss and damages for the Philippines, it's expected to be around 7.5% of our GDP in 2030 and probably around 12% in 2040. Now this is a lot to take on, but this is a tale that's not only specific to the Philippines, it's the same for ASEAN, where 4 out of 10 ASEAN countries have been identified as high risk. It's also the same story for Asia Pacific, because we've been identified by WMO as most disaster-prone region. So an understanding not just of the governance framework, but also of the realities that we have to overcome is essential for us to be successful.
Thank you so much. It is important to hear about these issues here in Philippines, which is so vulnerable, and that adaptation will play such an important role and hopefully can help with development, and it's important to hear a collaborative approach to that. So thank you. We're going to turn next to Dr. Collette. What perspectives does Australia bring to this? How are you thinking about good governance, the new economy in the region and at home?
Thank you. When I was thinking about this panel and about this Open Government Partnership Forum, I was reflecting on my almost 20 years in the Australian Public Service. And for all of that time, it's been really clear as an Australian public servant that what we are doing has to be transparent and accountable, and that citizens have to be empowered to participate in government processes. They're really core values of Australian government that have existed for a very long time. We've been members of this Open Government Partnership since 2013, so 12 years now. And those principles haven't changed, but what has changed, of course, is the challenges that we're all facing, like climate change, for example. So we now have a forum in Australia which has both government and civil society members who work on how to address the new challenges that we're confronting as part of this partnership. And they've come up with our 3rd action plan. And there's 2 particular parts of the action plan that I would like to talk about today, as they are really critical in the world that we now face. And we're grappling with how to deal with these challenges. We certainly don't have all the answers. The first one is automated decision-making and artificial intelligence within government. Because some of you may know, in Australia, a few years ago, we had a really challenging situation where the government tried to introduce a kind of artificial intelligence, kind of automated decision-making in our social security sector. We tried to introduce an automated debt repayment system. It went very badly wrong. There was lots of very negative publicity about this. And so in response to that, the government is trying to establish a much clearer framework for the use of automated decision-making and artificial intelligence in government. Because the key thing is there has to be human oversight, because robots don't tend to have much in the way of ethics, as far as I'm aware. And so you need to have really clear legal frameworks, and you need to have human oversight. So you can use those tools, that they can be effective, they can be innovative, they can be very efficient, they can be very helpful to government, but never to take the human element out of it entirely. And so we've established an AI advisory body, which has proposed mandatory guardrails for how we deal with AI, and we've committed $40 million to try to establish how we can support safe and responsible AI and coordinate this across government. So that's one key thing that we're doing. Another commitment I think is really interesting as well in 2025, and that's around misinformation and disinformation. And it's specifically about culturally and linguistically diverse communities. That's a term in Australia we use for essentially ethnic communities. Communities that don't necessarily use English as their first language, who are not necessarily comfortable in English. We all know what the challenges are with the digital world. It's great that we have access to so much information at our fingertips, but we all know that it's also risky because a lot of the information you see is not necessarily reliable. These new forms of media don't have the same kinds of structures around them that old forms of media had. But what we found in Australia is this is particularly risky in communities that don't speak English as their first language because they are relying predominantly on those kinds of digital medias. They're not necessarily using the old school kind of media that other communities are using. And so now we're working very closely with ethnic communities and representatives of those communities to work out how we can educate populations to be more savvy and more critical as they approach this kind of media. As I said at the start, we don't have all the answers yet, but I think it's a really important area to explore so that people, when they're consuming information, know how to critically analyze it and question it and look for other sources instead of just believing what it is they're reading on the internet. So those are just two. I think we've made 8 commitments in our 3rd National Action Plan, and those are just 2 of them. But they're 2, I think, that speak to this idea of the new economy and how we're grappling with these challenges today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that just is getting us warmed up. We've talked about climate change adaptation, artificial intelligence, and disinformation and misinformation. So if you haven't picked up the pattern, these are some of the areas that are absolutely critical today. And they are common to many of the countries that we work in, and they are only starting to show up in action plans. So that's why we have great panelists today with some of these cutting-edge commitments in their action plans. But we're going to pivot to some of the other issues affecting the country today, each in their unique way. Before we do that, I have one more question for Secretary Borja, or not before we do that. As we dive deeper into climate change in particular here, and you're going to see a theme that energy comes up a lot. Climate change demands urgent action, particularly in the energy sector. How is Philippine government balancing this urgency with the need for thorough deliberation and high-quality investment? Right? We don't want to do things so fast that they're not done well, or we spend too much and they don't deliver. Can you share with us one of the examples of how you're working on this issue here in the Philippines?
Thank you. I think what's important to note that under this administration of President Marcos, there's a clear emphasis on transformative climate action. For the Philippines, there are 2 approaches, of course. Adaptation is important for us because we're a high-risk country when it comes to climate change. But mitigation is also seen as an important step because we are, of course, addressing the root causes of climate change. But for us, mitigation is not only a responsibility under the UNFCCC, the government also recognizes that it is an opportunity, and therefore, because it's an opportunity for investment and growth, there's an opportunity to engage other stakeholders to drive the growth that the Philippines wants and needs. So what we do have the Philippine Energy Plan already, and any plan of the government, since it's enshrined in our Constitution, participatory governance is required. It's a product of consultation. Now we understand again the tension that arises because of this, because it's a question of how long can these consultations take place and when do we get to implement them. It's the same thing for the National Adaptation Plan. It's the same thing for the Nationally Determined Contribution Implementation Plan. But what's important is, again, the approach under the Marcos administration to be inclusive in the discussions. And this includes not just stakeholders of vulnerable sectors, the academe, but also includes businesses. And equally important, the involvement of our external partners. And in this, they have been working very closely with us on a needs-based approach to determine the pathways for mitigation, to determine the best areas for investment, and with multilateral finance institutions and development partners such as Australia, we're headed towards that. And again, this is key. Participatory governance is not just about working with internal partners. It's also important to work with external partners that will help us reach the objectives that we have.
Thank you so much. Now let's pivot to Indonesia. We're going to stay on the theme of energy. Pak Eri, can you tell us about Max Power in Indonesia? Can you tell us about Max Power?
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, we had a good experience in Indonesia where a company, namely Max Power, is a rental genset company. And investment comes from Standard Chartered, while Standard Chartered was scrutinized because of the sanctions of their transaction with Iran. And then Max Power, alleged based on the whistleblower, there is an allegation that Max Power has a corruption case. They bribe PLN. PLN is the state electricity company to get a contract. So DOJ and FBI came to Jakarta and make some investigation. But in fact, there is no strong case of corruption. It's just facilitation payment, petty corruption, just to port officials, police officers, just like that. And then we clear that, and DOJ make a clearance that there is no corruption case. And then what Max Power did is they are applying systems, governance, good corporate governance system in such a way that get an accreditation from ISO 37001, which is ABMS, Anti-Bribery Management System, and then join our coalition Action Against Corruption, or KAKI, in Indonesia. So by having that, then Max Power can grow, having more contract from the state electricity company.
Great. So you had, it's a really interesting case with Max Power because they were a big power generator. They got caught up in this case. They ended up turning a lemon, as we say, into lemonade in terms of getting anti-corruption certification. And that's an interesting case with the private company. But what does this have to do with Indonesia's national, the PLN, the government-owned utility? And what should they be doing about this, since this is the open government partnership?
What energy transition, you mean?
What does this have to do with the PLN and as the energy utility? What role should they be taking in terms of encouraging good governance by companies and making sure that there's not corruption in the energy sector as we do the transformation?
Okay. What PLN, as a state-owned energy utility company, has to do is that they have to have a clear plan when they seize the coal-fired power plant. But the problem is that the power purchase agreement between PLN as a state electricity company with private companies said the time frame is about 30 or 40 years. So because it linked to the coal reserves that supplied to the coal-fired power plant. So if the PLN stop the power plant now, then the private company will sue PLN. Or if PLN say 30 years from now, this coal-fired power plant should be ceased, then the private company will sue PLN. So this is the civil case that PLN has to be considered seriously.
So that's really interesting what you're saying, because I think we've heard a lot about open contracting here in Philippines. That's one of the big flagship commitments and one of the large achievements and thinking about, with coal-fired power plant, how do you structure a contract in an open contracting way that incentivizes, doesn't lock you into dirty power, doesn't lock you into poor governance standards. And so perhaps we'll come back and dive a bit deeper into what better contracting and better standards would look like in this sector. So we're going to now pivot to Mongolia, to Duya. And we're going to talk about the issue of information integrity, or disinformation, misinformation. Interestingly, I think we might start with another story about energy, but this time talking about mining and uranium. So how do we take it away? What story do you want to tell us?
Okay, so you specifically asked that I share a specific example. So I wanted it to be current. So basically what we do in Mongolia, Nest Center does, is we try to help media organizations establish sustainable business models so that they can keep on creating the stories and news that people need, the audiences need. And secondly, we do debunking, fact-checking on social media so that people will be exposed to less falsehoods on social media, and basically to build their media and information literacy. So basically, during COVID, if people were masked, although there were harmful germs out there or COVID out there, people were protected, right? So basically that's our approach. So based on our experience, starting from end of 2024, we started seeing a lot of information or disinformation about uranium mining and how it causes birth defects in humans and animals. So starting from November 2024, in the months leading up to Mongolian government's negotiation and expected agreement with France for a third neighbor investment into uranium mining in Mongolia, we started seeing that kind of information, and that's what we have been working on. And until today, which is over a month period, we've debunked 8 types of disinformation connected to uranium mining, and we are still working on 5 more to be published in the next few days. So for instance, there was a photo or a series of photos of children with birth defects claiming that it's from Mongolia and claiming that it's from previous experiences or experiments of mining uranium in Mongolia. And after checking the photos, it was actually from 2017 from Iraq. There's another series of photos showing a baby sheep which has 2 giant eyes but looks kind of more like a baby goat, saying it's also from the livestock that were in the area where uranium was mined. But it was from 2013 from, I think, Jordan. And the causes of those defects are not directly related to uranium, but depleted uranium is kind of in the discussion and not really finalized. So we included that in the fact checks. The reason that I'm sharing this story is because we have seen 2 trends in those stories. Firstly, this is not the first time we're seeing that kind of stories in Mongolia. This has been recurring in Mongolian society and the information ecosystem since 2013, which is when I think Mongolian government established a company called Mongatom to explore possibilities of exploiting or mining uranium in Mongolia. And every time Mongolian government does any action to speed up this process, this kind of information comes out. Second most important thing is that the network, so we observed that this is the same network that's continuing to basically bring this kind of information up multiple times, and the network that disseminates this kind of information is, you probably guessed it, the same network that disseminated Sputnik-related information during COVID the most, so basically saying Pfizer causes birth defects and Sputnik doesn't, and no vaccination if not Sputnik kind of narrative. So I think that would be one example how coordinated malign information operations could potentially threaten a country like Mongolia's attempt for economic independence. And just a little bit of a context in Mongolia. It's like if you look at the global democracy map, you would see that majority of it is already red or orange, not free or partially free. And in the huge space between Russia and China, you see a very small green dot, and that's us, and we intend to keep it that way.
Great. And in our last minute, as we touch on this, there's been a lot of changes in the digital space, which change how you're able to do your investigations. What's happening there?
You guys probably all heard that fact checkers are censors that Mark Zuckerberg kind of announced to the world at the beginning of this year. So I guess that's us. So basically, since 2 years ago, we have been observing Meta kind of shrink their news integrity policy, content moderation team when they basically fired a lot of people. And that trend continued with the change in administration as well. And very contrary to everything that Mark Zuckerberg himself has been saying in his previous statements in the Congress or other publications, he basically claimed that fact-checking was a form of censorship and limiting freedom of expression, and we do not agree to that. Basically what we do as an IFCN signatory and Meta's third-party fact-checking partner is we add context to the information that's already being disseminated. So what we do is we find all the facts that would prove the information either misleading, false, missing context, among others, and we connect that piece of information to the information, false information that's already being disseminated, so that the readers can see the fact check before they're exposed to the falsehood. So they have the choice to whether be exposed to the falsehood or believe the fact check and go on. So that's what we do. So in doing so, actually Meta's third-party fact-checking program is an immense help to us. Of course, there's funding attached to it, but more importantly, it gives us access to the platform itself and actually make that connection, do the labeling, and finding this information faster because of analyzing, because we're able to analyze how the information is being disseminated. So that's something that is very important to how we work. Last year in 2024, August, they also shut down Roundtable, which is a very powerful tool which helped us do the analysis, which I just shared in my previous response. So those things are changing. So obviously, tech platforms are closing off access to information, access to background information for academia and fact checkers to do analysis and research. So that's going to definitely be a challenge for us.
Thank you. Yes, we'll have to figure out a way forward now that the platforms seem to be disengaging from this type of work, or at least changing their tactics. We're going to pivot to Sri Lanka now. Sangeeta, tell us about the crisis that Sri Lanka found itself in a few years.
Yes. I think it's unfortunately something that hit the headlines the world over. Sri Lanka's economic crisis, the worst since its independence, that we hit in 2022. And what we had at this point of time was that Sri Lanka, for the first time, had to default on its sovereign debt. People were on the streets because the country couldn't afford to provide fuel to the people anymore. So people were queuing up in front of petrol stations trying to get fuel to get from point A to point B. Inflation rose to about 50% at one point in the country. Poverty increased, child malnutrition increased. And at the same time, what you found was that people started protesting. The people started protesting on the streets against corruption and bad governance. So for the first time in a long time, you could see that the people understood the link between the economic crisis and the fact that the country had been badly governed for a period of time, and that one caused the other. So that was the dire situation, within which we also had Sri Lanka having to go back to the IMF for the 17th time to restructure its debt and get assistance from the IMF.
And what linked corruption to this debt crisis? How are these two things related?
Yeah, so I will answer that in terms of two pieces of evidence, if you will, that connected those protests on the street where people were asking the president to go home, asking all 225 members of parliament to step down, that you can even sometimes write off as, you know, the people being emotional, the people just, you know, getting into a mob mentality and asking for change. But it was not that, and the best proof of that was that a group of civil society and academics went to the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka and asked that certain individuals, including the then sitting president, the prime minister who had just stepped down in response to the protest, two former central bank governors, certain members of the monetary board, etc., asking the Supreme Court to hold that those people, by mismanaging the economy, had violated the rights of the people. So now, if you will, a Supreme Court decision has to be reasoned, has to be based in fact, has to be grounded in reality, rather than just what could be dismissed as an emotional call. So this was one example that clearly, in a way, certified and acknowledged that this was a governance crisis. It was a man-made crisis rather than just an economic crisis that we couldn't help but fall into because of COVID or any external factors. The second thing is that when the IMF engaged in the country, it also acknowledged through a governance diagnostic assessment that it did for the country for the first time in Asia, that Sri Lanka's corruption problem was macro-critical. So it could have a massive economic impact in the country. So both these things show that, both these pieces of evidence, if you will, show that there was a huge connection between corruption and the debt crisis that Sri Lanka had got into.
So you've mentioned the IMF and civil society reviews, and there was a number of recommendations that came through there. In the interest of time, though, I want to ask about something that's really new, and that I think Sri Lanka might be the first country to do, is actually issuing what is called a governance-linked bond. In the short time we have, can you explain, as best you can, what this new financial instrument is and why it's interesting to these folks?
So as I mentioned before, Sri Lanka was in a debt crisis and had to restructure its debt in its negotiations with the private bondholders internationally. And what Verite Research, my current organization, did was invent a new debt instrument called a governance-linked bond. And what this does is, if Sri Lanka performs well on its governance commitments, then Sri Lanka receives a rate cut on its interest that it owes to its bondholders. And this is we call this a win-win situation, because for the bondholders themselves, if governance improves in the country that they're investing in, what that means is that the bond itself would have a better secondary market value. So there is a long-term interest and link to money here in improving the governance in the country. So what this instrument does is it creates an incentive for the government to perform better on its governance indicators. And now that this has been accepted by bondholders in the bond market, this is an instrument that others in the region and in the world can actually use and contextualize to your governance needs, to each country's governance needs in its bond issuing processes.
Great, thank you for explaining that. So basically, governments get cheaper money if they have less corruption.
Exactly.
Great. That's a really interesting thing that we hope to take deeper dives into in OGP over the coming time. Okay, so now we're going to go back to each panelist, and the question for each panelist, you all get the same question now, but of course, we've covered so many different topics. If you could snap your fingers and have one open government reform around transparency, participation, public accountability, what would it be? Especially, maybe there's things that are relevant across the region. And we'll think about things that might be outside of the box. About a minute each, so these lightning round. We'll just go starting from here to the end.
Well, I would say participation is key, and it's difficult to achieve. We can have forums like this, and we do in Australia, but actually getting people, ordinary citizens, to participate is really hard because, of course, They need motivation to participate. They need to believe that something is going to happen because of it. They need to trust government and think that it's worthwhile. And that's quite difficult to generate, I think. And it also requires governments to be quite vulnerable, because often governments want to defend the policies that they have. They want to tell everyone that they're doing a good job. It's difficult to open up and encourage a conversation with ordinary citizens. And so I would say that's a key thing that I would like to see happen much more of, both in Australia and across the region.
Hello? You're probably not going to like my answer. My initial answer was actually transparency. And then I was thinking about it, like, it was the same feeling I got when we were kind of advocating for gender equality. And then we wanted 50%, then we said 40, and then okay, 30. So I just don't feel like it's a compromise. I mean, I'm not really willing to compromise on this. Like, this is an OGP event, and open governance, I think, encompasses all. And as a citizen of a democratic country, I think I just want an open government, including all, and because it's the bare minimum. Yeah.
Thank you. If I could snap my finger, I wish we had more lighting so I could see the audience. It's very difficult to be speaking on such a serious issue. No? But if I could do that, I think we'd focus on two things. We have the climate change expenditure tagging in the Philippines. And it's important because it's a digital platform where our external and internal stakeholders get to see where the public investment goes to in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. And it goes into the heart of transparency, accountability, participation, and open governance. But if we had significant improvements on this, including a better understanding of the different elements of our government and development partners, we can push this agenda even further and make climate change, adaptation, and mitigation in the Philippines even more meaningful and transformative as it should be. Another thing I think which is important for ASEAN is the creation of a regional open framework for climate finance and carbon markets. I say this in the context of ASEAN because there is already cooperation, and it's an entity in itself. It's important when we want to transition and we want to support mitigation efforts globally that there is trust and confidence in the system and the governance framework. To do that, it's very complicated, we know, but simple things such as a registry and making sure that the system is understandable to the different sovereign states and the different stakeholders, it would help for a meaningful participation, and it would help address lingering concerns on the transparency of existing mechanisms. I would have to refer to some serious concerns on transparency by third-party verifiers. And it's important that ASEAN can show the way, whereby transparency, accountability, participation, and open data on a platform that's available not just for ASEAN, but also for the entire Asia-Pacific region, so that there's learning and that we move forward on such an existential issue as climate change.
Harry?
It's hard to choose, Joe. All are the same importance as the pillars of open government, but if I have to choose, then public participation is could represent accountability and transparency. So public participation is the most important among those three pillars. And on how changes that we have to make, maybe in this regional countries we can share experience, we can share lessons learned, but the most important thing is that how to incentivize the integrity. Okay. Government cannot be always suspicious to the private sectors. Private sectors are not all bandidos, yeah. Some of them are having a good willingness to be a good corporate governance company. Okay? So by having that, then the government should set up an incentive, I don't know, fiscal incentive or easier license permits, something like that. And the other one is, integrating database among countries in this region. So I think it started already with the tax, if I'm not mistaken, yeah? That could be expanded to other sectors. On the other one is, I think we have to encourage each other. I want to use the word provoke, but it's too hard. Provoke or remind each other about how important governance, okay? Governance, transparency, accountability as a pillar of governance is not only definition or requirements, it's necessity. It's not just governance, it's also economic advantage for all countries. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Sangeeta?
Yeah, so if I had to pick one of the principles, I would pick transparency, because both public participation and accountability tend to hinge upon transparency, if you had to pick one. But I just want to focus on public participation for today, because in the midst of the economic crisis as well, it is really public participation in all forms, both in creating a parallel civil society diagnostic, in protesting on the streets, that people even managed to get regime change, managed to call for elections, managed to protest against certain laws that were considered to be draconian. So in particularly difficult contexts where, we were calling out the facets even of state capture, it is public participation that managed to the extent possible, and we are yet to see whether the change has been achieved, that we managed to achieve a level of reversal. And that took participation not just from the downtrodden, not just from the poor, not just from those lobby groups that generally work on these issues, but from the public at every stage. Academia going to court, doing little teach-out sessions alongside the protests, talking about urban planning, talking about politics, talking about campaign financing. People from, estate workers in Sri Lanka for years who had been talking for, or speaking up for fair wages, coming to the protests and talking about it. Lots of TV programs where protesters were given the space to talk about the issues that they were facing. And then, the urban, relatively rich, middle-class crowds actually getting on the streets because they almost had the privilege to be able to protest while the country was on their knees. It took participation from all levels, alongside the traditional protesters, if you will, the political parties, all of them, for change to come about, for government to be opened up in, increasing degrees. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think this, if there's a cross-cutting theme, or a set of cross-cutting themes that are coming here, is maybe the way we've done open government could be expanded a bit. On the who's involved, we could bring in private sector, media folks a bit more, and on the topics, obviously, that we're working on, but also some of the tools that we're using. As Ari said, how are we incentivizing behavior? We talked about governance-linked bonds. We talked about third-party certification. We talked about other fiscal incentives that people might have to try to improve that. We are strangely a little bit ahead of time, so let's ruin that. And does anyone have anything that they'd like to add to other reforms that they want to highlight in these areas?
Yeah,
please.
I think what's important to understand, and given the lens of the Philippines and our own social democratic experience, no, Sri Lanka now is we wish for Sri Lanka's success, but the Philippines has had its own issues as well in the not so recent past. But it's important that we have civil society involved in the work, and that I think is the strength of open government, and it's become enshrined principles at least in the Philippines, and people have a greater sense of accountability. But make no mistake, it's not easy. It's an iterative process whereby it's not only accountability on the public sector, but also the private sector that's needed. It's also a process whereby people have to devote time to make the change that they want. Sometimes it's incoherent, sometimes it's coherent, based on the experience of the Philippines, whereby CSOs have organized themselves. Insofar as climate change, they do have a very strong voice. It makes government stand on its toes, but not to consider them as antagonists, but partners in the process. And this, I think, is something that we should continue to advise and inform our stakeholders. There are a lot of risks involved. Of course, as part of government, we've also been on the receiving end of criticisms, but we look at it as part of the process, continuing, and then we're very clear on what we want to achieve. If you don't have that type of vision, then frustration sets in and you become distrustful of the democratic values and the institutions that you're supposed to be anchoring your work on. So it should be a self-reinforcing system, and that, I guess, is the function of a democracy, and that's also a function of cooperative work within the region, so that values are appreciated, values become embedded in processes, values become the bedrock of institutions that are supposed to deliver the change that governments and nations need.
Just to add, I think I completely agree with you, Secretary. They're really interesting points to make. And I would say from where I'm sitting, it looks very much as though the lines between government, private sector, and civil society are increasingly blurred. So, I mean, in a democracy, the citizens have always been part of government or have always been able to make demands on government. But I think increasingly the lines between those different actors are very much blurred. So particularly in an area like climate change, governments can regulate, governments can create incentives, but they can't make the change themselves. It's mostly going to be the private sector that will need to make the transition. And certainly from an Australian government perspective, we are working and intend to work very closely with the private sector on that in particular. And civil society organizations are a really important part of the picture. They're the ones, ordinary citizens are the ones that have to seek the change, they have to want the change, otherwise it certainly won't happen. So it's absolutely a team effort, I would say.
If I can just add, in the Philippine experience, at least in the Climate Change Commission and the issue, we've had a very forthcoming and a very open engagement with the CSOs, civil society, and private sector. And because of institutionalization of our engagement framework with development partners, CSOs, the academe, the local government units, the private sector, we're working on a greater appreciation of the work that we do. There have been some criticisms, but a third party, it's the Climate Change Performance Index. It shows that the policies of government have improved. In fact, the Philippines is ranked 7th in the world and the first in Asia Pacific to do this. And this is, I think, a product of consistent, conscientious process of engaging in a transparent and accountable manner all of the stakeholders. Certainly, the state is supposed to push this object and instrument of policy. But again, it's a virtuous cycle that must be protected. And if we see these types of fruits, it encourages, again, trust and confidence in the work that we do, in the hard decisions that government has to make, and which the public have to understand and also fully support in the long term.
Thank you so much. Do others have anything to add or new topic?
I was just thinking about the accountability issue because we already talked about public sector and private sector, and I wanted to touch a little bit on the CSO and the media side of that. I mean, there are good examples internationally where media and civil society organizations basically announce how they are transparent and accountable. One of the tools is the Journalism Trust Initiative developed by the Reporters Without Borders. It's an ISO standard that is recognized by EU law for media organizations to announce basically how they are creating the information. Are they taking into account what the journalists think, or is it just the owner's opinion and things like that? So this is a very living mechanism where media organizations can basically assess themselves and announce, transparently announce what kind of operations they have. I think it would be very beneficial for CSOs to have a similar system. I don't know if it already exists, I'm sorry, but so that means like while the CSO's role is to recognize and understand, see problems before the government has the time to, or government has the chance to act to, and basically make it aware for the government so that they can work together to solve that problem, right, basically. So in doing so, it's important that the civil society organizations announce how they make that decision, how they identify problems. Are there conflicts of interests, right? So being transparent in that way would really help both parties or all parties trust each other and work together without no strings attached. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add that context.
That's helpful. And when we think about platforms, I think to bring an experience from outside of the region, I think Europe is, in their Digital Services Act, is bringing in this trusted flaggers system where they have people outside of the European Union civil service who can flag where issues are arising around information quality, artificial intelligence, and these types of issues. So formalizing it a bit more as well is an interesting element there. Do you have any additions from anyone else over here?
Sure. I must say we're struggling to hear the other panelists, but just in terms of adding from our experience, because it's been such an exceptional case in Sri Lanka that could be instructive to others. Having been in the anti-corruption space for a little while, I can't highlight enough or emphasize enough the strength it brought to the movement to push for open government when civil society organizations and other sectors joined the fight against corruption and joined from their own perspectives this push for open government. So it was when the economists started talking about corruption in the midst of an economic crisis that people started taking it seriously, rather than seeing as civil society just being the usual alarmist, extremist group that calls always for, remarkable change that can never be achieved in this lifetime, right? So it made a huge difference. It actually added credibility to both sides when people joined hands in the demand for change. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, thank you. Any other additions before we move? We might move to audience Q&A to hear if there's any questions here. Secretary?
Or maybe we can ask the audience.
Yeah, you could ask the audience too. Wonderful. Well, let's then go to audience Q&A. I believe there's microphones here, and there. People have questions for any of the panelists here about what you can learn from these different countries, or what you can, their particular experiences and policies, or questions. Please line up at the microphones if you can. We'll start here. Please, Kathy.
Hi, Joe. I thought I might start it. Well, I'm the host, but I'm really curious because I'm a financial journalist here, and it's just very fresh in the news. As you know, Trump 2.0, disrupting and changing radically things and options perhaps, and maybe the approach to governance, as well as how we see open government partnership. So I was wondering how you see this evolving from your points of view, especially in the Philippines, sir. It's good to hear our climate change priorities there, but how do you see that changing, and how are you going to go along it to ensure that the advocacy of OGP carries on, even under Trump 2.0?
Thank you, Kathy. That's a very difficult question, and there may be. I don't want to speak as an official at this point. I think it's in the purview of our Department of Foreign Affairs to speak of that. But I think it's a development that we cannot not acknowledge. In this case, we understand that certain societies have their own sovereign decisions, and they have made that decision and placed their trust in certain individuals to lead. That being said, I think it's a function of a mature democracy that certain values are institutionalized. Of course, relationships will definitely be affected. It is up to the different partners, and that includes the Philippines, which considers the United States an important partner, in fact, the only ally, formal ally that we have. In this case, one would think that we have to look for opportunities in what's happening. And it's still important that we found our actions, collective actions, towards, we found these strongly on shared values and common principles. Perhaps the lesson here is that we have to be trustful of the work that we do in building the institutions and the values. Because if we simply focus on a certain individual, I think that's a disservice to the work that we've continued to have when it comes to open government. Again, I say that we fully respect, of course, the decisions of a sovereign country, but that does not mean that relationships and cooperation and partnerships between and among other countries cannot happen. And I think, the United States, the American people have their own processes to follow, but they will also realize that things will have to work a certain way, because realities around the world are also experienced by all. Again, it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think despite developments, there is common space for everybody, and it's only a call, I think, for us to be even stronger in the work that we do on open government principles. I say this several years back, more than a decade back, when OGP was considered first in the Philippines, and I remember very strongly the United States, Brazil, and the Philippines working on this. I think the processes and the institutions are mature, and what we need to do is look at points of convergence and then prove that partnerships and the principles really do work, and people will recognize that. Thank you.
Can I also add, because I find myself agreeing with you, Secretary, again, I'm not in a position to comment on what President Trump intends to do with regard to open government, but I started out today by talking about how Australia has had this commitment in government to transparency, accountability, and integrity at least as long as I've been in government, and actually for a lot longer, and that's not going to change. So from our perspective, we remain committed to open government, we remain committed to working with civil society and other stakeholders, and we remain committed, importantly, to collaboration across the region. This region for us is extremely important, and that isn't going to change. We want to continue to discuss these issues with all of our partners in the region, including the Philippines, where I currently work, and advance all these principles of open government together. So I'm less concerned about what individual countries plan to do. I can't control that. I am concerned with what we are committed to and what we want to share with other countries in our region.
I mean, my perspective is just my perspective, so I'm gonna speak freely. The change with the U.S. government and the policy, it's something that's on our mind a lot recently, but the funding freeze is not the main risk that we're seeing. I mean, it is big, it is important, but that's not the main threat that as civil society organizations or civil society or media we're saying. The key threat here is the attitude change. Attitude towards being open, attitude towards being collaborative is changing. And what we're seeing in the information space is, I'm gonna be very straight, mostly Russian networks picking up on it and basically broadening their horizon, trying to fill in the gap that is now created with this policy change. I don't have like an answer or a position on this yet, but I just thought it was something that we're observing, and the gap might be filled in with not very welcome people in the world. So it's just a piece of information that I am observing, and I wanted to share so that we're kind of mindful of what other like areas it's opening up as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, a provocative question, and one that we'll be discussing for a long time. We have 3 questions that I can see, so maybe we'll take them, let's take all 3, and then we'll have the panelists respond to the ones that they think are relevant in the remaining time that we have. Please, sir.
Yes, good morning. I'm Joel Tantores from the University of the Philippines. I'd like just to ask a short, probably feedback about freedom of information legislation, say in the particular countries of our panelists. Do you have such, no, where there is a law that clearly pronounces or mandates the policy that government should provide ready access to public information or information coming from government offices? So a quick say yes or no, and maybe any of the panelists can add, if there is none, in the case of the Philippines, and this would be confirmed by Secretary Robert, there's none. We have a administrative measure to provide this FOI, okay? And if there's no legislation providing that legal mandate, what measures are being done to promote public access or access of stakeholders to government information? Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's do the other 2 questions if you don't mind, and then we'll come back to the yes/no part and the longer answer so you can prepare yourself. Yes, sir, over here.
I'm sorry for jumping the queue, but I defer to the moderator. I'm Sunny Africa from Ibon Foundation and Defend NGOs in the Philippines. Fantastic discussions the last day and a half about the Open Government Partnership, but I want to sort of ask a question about the other side of the partnership. OGP speaks about the mechanisms involving civil society, but I think there are some structural shifts happening right now. Civil society is beleaguered. They're being civic spaces closing because of government action, but also civic space being eroded by a lot of foreign policy directions, especially in Western Europe, where funding for civil society is being cut. So I'm kind of wondering, it's fantastic to talk about the mechanisms for open government partnership, but are we thinking about what's going to happen if the other part of the partnership is being diminished, both by Trump 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever, but in larger sense, there really is diminishing support and I think momentum in civil society worldwide. So I think, how will that partnership work out when you're losing the civil society half of the partnership? Thank you.
Okay. And the last question before we go to the panelists.
Thank you. My name's Mel Flanagan. I'm from Australia, from a social enterprise called Nook Studios. So I've been working on open government advocacy and designing open government systems since 2012. Sorry if you can't hear me, I'll speak in. So I think the points that were brought up today around who is in the room with OGP is really important, because over the years, one of the things that's a real challenge is the language we use is very exclusive. It's not very inclusive. So it's very hard for people who aren't part of this and who have been around to really engage with it, specifically communities and I think some of the private sector. So I definitely agree the private sector is the group we can be bringing in to this a bit more, but in that kind of inclusive way, because as Eri was saying, we're judged because we're private. Or we're judged because we're not civil society. I think the other thing is media is definitely important, and also investors, because so much of all of these things that we talk about really are we're trying to find the race to the top. So how do we, and investors are really a part of showing that there is that investability, or that there's that stability, that there's that credibility in the work that we're doing. And I think that's so important in terms of what's happening geopolitically as well. So my question to you is, we talk a lot about civil society in this movement, but there's impacted communities that don't have a voice. And I think, how can we open up this space really for citizens? Because there's a layer for civil society, but it's really, how do we bring impacted communities more into this space, and how do we provide those channels where it's not just ask us once, it's that collaboration that everyone's trying to get to. So thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question, a nice set of questions, one on freedom of information legislation, the next one on civic space closing and civil society and what we're going to do about that, and then the last one about how to involve communities in OGP processes. So we'll just go down the panel. People can pick what they want. First, your assignment was to answer yes, no, whether you have a freedom of information law, and then pick the topics that you think are most relevant. And I think we have about 2 minutes each.
Yes, we have freedom of information legislation in Australia. I've been involved in many of these processes. We have very strict rules around what government has to do. So citizens can ask for any information that they want from government, and government must respond and must provide information within certain timeframes. And if the citizens don't like or don't believe that they've been given all the information, then there's appeals processes. It's a very strict process, and government is absolutely required to give the information that has been asked for within certain parameters, as you can imagine. But absolutely, we have that legislation that's been in place for a very long time. On the other questions, huge questions, what I would highlight is just from Australia's perspective in the Philippines. I'm responsible for our development program here, and a huge part of our development program now is focusing on what we call locally led development. And so the idea is that although we do a lot in partnership with the Philippine government, a crucial part of our development programming now is deliberately working with local communities and civil society organizations based on the belief that they are the ones that know best what is required for them to achieve whatever development outcome it is that we're looking at. Economic growth, for example, gender equality, climate change objectives. And so we do seek out organizations that are working at the grassroots level, not just as consultation, but actually to lead on and very much be a part of those programs. It's just one small microcosm. Government obviously has a huge remit, but from our perspective here in the Philippines, that's a crucial aspect of our development programming, and it's been working really, really well. So it's something that I would encourage other governments to do as well.
If I could take the freedom of information law question. Thank you for asking that. It's very relevant and very timely for me, especially because Mongolia does have a freedom of information law, but on top of that, we have a press freedom law as well, which was approved in 1998. And right now, we are currently in the discussion of proposing a new law. Actually, the Ministry of Justice and Home Affairs, 2 weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so, submitted a new draft to the Parliament for discussion. And with that being said, if Philippines doesn't have that law yet, I mean, in the case of Mongolia, our experience shows that it's probably better working in the gray environment rather than working in a restricted environment, restricted by new coming laws. Because the new draft that we have received that was currently submitted to the Parliament has a number of pretty alarming clauses that would further close the space that journalists are going to be able to work with. For instance, media organizations should protect national security. It does sound meaningful, does sound right, but when you legislate that, it opens the door for closed court hearings. So when a journalist is accused, the people will not know anything about why the journalist is accused and things like that. There's another thing about facts. Journalists and media organizations should only report based on facts. But what happens in a world where the ultimate power decides what facts are? So that's a very dangerous clause. So I mean, it would take the whole day if I read through all the problematic clauses in that law. But I'm not to say that this law or these changes are coming from a bad place, but it's coming from lack of discussions and trust between the industries like state and civil society. The Ministry of Justice did, I think, at least 5 discussions with media organizations, and each time they made small changes, but like not really looking into the bigger picture. So there's definitely a lot more room to watch what's happening in the legislative environment, especially when it comes to civic space, and really, really work on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Secretary?
Thank you. Thank you for those 3 questions. I think I'll be speaking as a private citizen, and I think it also goes back to my history as a former broadcast journalist, a development worker in Mindanao, a career diplomat in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and now as commissioner in the Climate Change Commission. These are 3 very valid questions. The first one, it's a yes or no question. The answer is no, but there is an executive order, I believe it's Executive Order 1, on freedom of information. And I've been privy to many attempts or many attempts by different stakeholders to use this mechanism so that government is held accountable. Is it perfect? No. But it is an existing mechanism in the Philippines. I would like to believe that transparency, accountability, participation, and open data are cornerstones of our governance. In the case of the Climate Change Commission, we get a lot of letters, a lot of queries, a lot of emails on data. It's become a source of motivation for us to put in a digital platform the data that we have so that it's shared with people. Thus, we have NICDs, thus we have CCET as well. So it goes back, it circles back again as a process and as a system and as an architecture. This needs to be further strengthened. I believe, Professor, that the FOI bill is currently in Congress and is being considered. And I hope, I as a private citizen hope that our legislators really look at this seriously and use it both as a motivation for better governance for our country. For the second question, the civil society space. I think, again, it's a function of the partnerships that we have with development partners. But I come from Mindanao, and I am witness, as Ibo knows, that the very strong CSO movement in Mindanao and throughout the Philippines is a product of arduous work through decades. And I think it's a mature part of our democracy that makes it become an essential part of governance and the work that we do. It might not be the same for different countries, and of course the Philippines will do its part in helping empower stakeholders outside of the Philippines. But again, partnerships are important across boundaries. OGB provides that platform. Let's not forget there are multilateral platforms already that are there. You talk about ASEAN, you talk about the United Nations, they're also there. But again, we have to make sure that these platforms and venues are further strengthened and becomes an opportunity for everybody to discuss the values that we treasure and hold dear. And it's important that we work with partners to continue pushing it. I would think that in the case of the Philippines, there's enough to really motivate and ensure that the civil society, the academe, scientists in the case of climate change are an important part of governance in the Philippines. And the third question is how to do it. Localizing the language is an important part of the work that we do at the Climate Change Commission, where climate change is seen as existential, but also something very esoteric when you try to explain that. So what we do is we engage our LGUs, we engage our academe, state colleges and universities to make principles and concepts more understood. Again, it's not easy, and we are in the midst of working on our national adaptation plan. But I agree with you, communication is key so that there's a better understanding of climate change. And if you transpose that into governance, there needs to be clear and continuous discussion on governance principles and how important they are so that the democracy that we have will continue to strengthen on each issue that we are concerned with and government as a whole. Thank you.
Pakeri?
Well, the first question, I think I agree with the Secretary. On the private sector's participation, I think I also agree that more private sector participation should be done by OGB. And on the other question of civil society, civil space, I think each of us has the same problem. we can share how to solve that problem and sharing experience, lessons learned, etc. Thank you.
I have to speak really fast. On freedom of information, Sri Lanka has the fourth strongest Right to Information Act in the world, based on the Center for Law and Democracy's rating of freedom of information laws. But that is law, and that doesn't talk about implementation and enforcement. But in terms of implementation and enforcement as well, Sri Lanka has had really, really good uptake, where we've had, even through OGP, we've seen massive successes where citizens just on the ground have been consistently using the Right to Information Act to get, small things like, a culvert in their neighborhood fixed, or to question about it, to getting water for their entire neighborhood, But also, why Sri Lanka's freedom of information law is strong and ranks so high is because it also applies to the private sector that contracts with the government. It applies to state-owned enterprises that have more than 25% shareholding by the state, or any company that has more than 25% shareholding. And there are very limited exemptions, and the state cannot, or an information officer cannot ever ask a citizen as to why they're requesting the information. So in these ways, it's a very, very strong law and can be replicated elsewhere and can be looked to as best practice. On the issue of civic space, because I again come from a country where civic space is such a contested issue, even as we begin to deal with this collective sense of repression, of the contraction of the space, I would just call on everyone to understand that why civic space is under attack is because it's worth attacking, right? So what we're doing here is really, really important going forward and becomes even more important going forward. So every single action matters. Every single word matters. And I can say this as a person who has been talking about these issues for a while. I always felt like we were speaking out into the void, right? That people were not listening to us, people were not taking us seriously. But during the protest movement that happened in Sri Lanka, we were told 100 times over that what we had been saying had in fact mattered. And while it feels like we're speaking in our little silos, in our little panels somewhere, on some show somewhere, that nobody's listening, each and every act of standing up and speaking up and educating, discussing, opening processes up has mattered. And I'm saying this not as a boast, but as a sharing of experience of something that even came as a surprise to me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we are at time. So I'm just going to wrap up real quick. This is a wide-ranging discussion that was intentionally by design. Like pancit bihon, like fried noodles. I have many ingredients here, and hopefully it was equally delicious. We touched on climate change, energy transition, artificial intelligence, information space, and public finance, and I'm probably missing a couple things. We touched on new actors in open government space, private sector, investors, journalists, communities, certification processes, a bunch of new open government tools. But most of all, I want to thank our panelists for participating today and bringing us all these stimulating new ideas. Thank you, Moya. Thank you, Duya. Thank you, Secretary Robert, Pakeri, and Sankita. And thank you to all of you who are participating. Enjoy the rest of the day and welcome your new ideas and innovations. Thank you very much.